The first time I knew something was wrong, it wasn't because of words or accusations. It was the silence. The kind of silence that lingers in a room after someone has left, even when they've only stepped out to take a phone call. I remember standing in my own kitchen, staring at the steam rising from a pot of soup, when I realized Mark's laughter from the patio sounded different, warmer, lighter. It wasn't meant for me. Through the glass door, I caught a glimpse of his phone angled away, his shoulders tilted as though protecting a secret. That small, instinctive gesture cracked something deep inside me, though I didn't say a word at the time. Before I go on, let me pause for a moment. These kinds of stories are often heavier when shared, but they can also bring us together. So as you listen, tell me in the comments where you're tuning in from tonight, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more true family stories. My name is Elena Brooks, and at 46, I had what most people would call an enviable life. I worked as a high school counselor in our quiet suburban town, guiding other people's children through their storms, while my own home seemed steady. My husband, Mark, had built a respectable career as a regional sales director, and together, we raised our daughter Lily, who was weeks away from her senior year. We weren't rich, but after years of saving, we were comfortable. On weekends, we took short trips to the coast, and every Christmas we hosted dinner at our house with Mark's father, Walter, who had always treated me with kindness. From the outside, our marriage looked like the kind that endured. We met in our 20s, both hungry to carve out a stable life after modest beginnings. I admired Mark's drive, his ability to walk into a room and make people listen. Where I was quiet and deliberate, he was bold and charming, the sort of man people noticed. Over time, we grew into our roles, me the anchor, him the sail. It worked, or at least it seemed to, until those small silences began appearing like hairline fractures in a foundation no one inspects until the house leans. I believed in family above all else. My parents had taught me that loyalty was a kind of inheritance passed from one generation to the next. I carried those lessons into my marriage, into every counseling session at school, even into how I raised Lily. That's why the shift unsettled me so deeply. Mark and I had once spoken easily about everything: the grocery bill, Lily's college plans, our hopes for retirement. But suddenly, his answers were shorter. He smiled less, or rather, he smiled differently. It was no longer the smile that belonged to us. Still, I brushed it aside. After more than 20 years together, I told myself people changed, that marriages ebbed and flowed. Maybe he was just tired from work, or maybe the weight of his father aging was on his mind. I kept cooking dinners, grading papers late at night, and reassuring Lily that her essays would take her far. But beneath all that routine, a knot had started to form in my chest. A quiet suspicion that I tried desperately to ignore, though I knew it would not stay hidden for long. That night, in the kitchen, soup simmering, and Mark laughing softly on the patio, I finally admitted to myself that something was breaking. I didn't know how deep the crack ran, or how much of my world would fall when it gave way, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty: the silence wasn't going away. It was only growing louder. The night of the soup simmering and the phone angled away was only the beginning. After that, I noticed how quickly Mark began finding excuses to stay late at work. It wasn't the kind of overtime that stretched toward promotions or projects I'd heard about before. These were vague explanations tossed over his shoulder as he grabbed his keys. "Don't wait up," he'd say, as though it were routine, but it wasn't routine for us. For years, we had built our evenings around dinner together, even if it was something simple like sandwiches on the porch. That rhythm slipped, and with it came the first undeniable tremors of betrayal. I began catching traces of a scent that didn't belong to me, a sweetness that clung faintly to his shirts, more floral than anything I owned, and it would linger even after the fabric had been through the wash. At first, I told myself it was nothing, maybe cologne from someone at the office brushing past him, but the scent was too consistent, too intimate. It carried a message quiet but insistent that someone else was close enough to him to leave her mark on what used to be mine. The absences stretched into weekends. He'd mention a golf outing with colleagues or a networking dinner that came up suddenly, and while he tried to make it sound ordinary, I knew his world wasn't structured like that. Mark was a man who planned his calendar weeks in advance, who got restless when routines slipped. Now he seemed to welcome unpredictability to lean into it. I pretended not to notice, but I did. I always noticed. It wasn't just time that shifted, it was tone. When I asked about his day, his answers shortened to single words, his eyes drifting to the glow of his phone before he looked at me. Sometimes he smiled in the middle of a conversation that had nothing worth smiling at, and I could almost see the shadow of someone else reflected in his expression. That smile wasn't meant for me anymore, though he still wore it under my roof. Then came the dinner party, the one hosted by our mutual friends, the Harrisons. I remember walking into their warmly lit dining room, the table dressed with candles, the scent of roast chicken carrying through the house. Mark and I arrived together, but I felt as though we were already miles apart. It didn't take long for my eyes to catch on her Tessa Grant standing near the fireplace. A glass of wine in her hand, and her voice pitched just loud enough to command attention. Tessa had been in our circle for years, a professional event planner with a way of slipping into the center of any gathering. We were the same age, though. She carried herself with the confidence of someone who never questioned where she belonged. She had a sharp laugh, one that drew others in, and that night it was Mark she seemed to direct it toward. His face lit up in response, brighter than it had in months, brighter than anything he'd offered me across our own dinner table. I sat through that meal watching small betrayals unfold in plain sight. The way his hand brushed her arm as he reached for a dish, the way their eyes lingered a beat too long across the table, as though they were carrying on a private conversation in the middle of a crowded room. My friends spoke around me, laughter spilling over wine and dessert, but I heard nothing clearly. Every detail blurred except for those two faces across from me, moving in a rhythm I was no longer part of. When we returned home, Mark didn't comment on how quiet I had been. He hung up his jacket, checked his phone, and disappeared into the shower, humming lightly under the spray as though nothing had shifted. But something had, and I felt it pressing against the walls of our house. I lay awake that night, with the sheets pulled up to my chin, listening to the sound of the water pipes and wondering how long he had been carrying this secret before I started to see it. The following week, Tessa's name began appearing more often. Mark mentioned her casually as though she had become an indispensable contact in his work. Tessa's helping us organize the regional conference, he'd say, or Tessa knows the right venue. Each mention was draped in normalcy, but my stomach clenched all the same. I had known Tessa for years, shared recipes and holiday decorations, even sat beside her at PTA fundraisers when Lily was younger. The thought that she might be the one behind those subtle changes in my husband's eyes was almost too much to accept. Still, I held my silence. I cooked the meals, kept the laundry folded, and listened as my daughter chattered about college applications. I played the part of a woman whose life remained intact, but inside, I felt the scaffolding of our marriage creak and strain. Every time Mark left the house without clear reason, every time Tessa's name slipped into a sentence, the strain grew louder. One evening, I walked past his office and noticed the glow of his computer screen left on. His phone lay face down on the desk beside it. I wasn't the kind of wife who snooped, but my hand hovered over that phone, aching to flip it over and see what might spill out. I didn't touch it, not yet, but the desire itself frightened me. It meant I no longer trusted the man I had once leaned on more than anyone else in this world. Even Walter, my father-in-law, seemed to sense something shifting. He visited for dinner one Sunday, his weathered hands wrapping around his coffee mug, as he studied his son across the table. Walter had built his life with sweat and labor, raising Mark to believe that family was a fortress. That evening, though, I caught him looking at me with quiet sympathy, as if he saw more than he said. I smiled back, pretending everything was fine, but a lump had already formed in my throat. The cracks were no longer hidden. They had moved from faint suspicions to visible fractures. I didn't have proof, not yet, but I had enough to know that the silence between us wasn't accidental. It was purposeful, a veil stretched to hide something I wasn't meant to see. And though I didn't speak of it aloud, I knew it was only a matter of time before the veil slipped entirely. That thought followed me into the night, pressing against me like a weight I couldn't shake. I lay there listening to Mark's steady breathing beside me, his arm draped across me in a gesture that felt more like possession than love. I stared at the ceiling and knew deep in the pit of my stomach that the first crack in our life had already become a fault line. It was only a matter of time before everything collapsed around it. There is a kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from work or sleepless nights. It comes from smiling when you want to cry, from listening when your heart is breaking. I found myself moving through each day as if I were made of glass, fragile but transparent. No one at school noticed, not the students who leaned across my desk for guidance or the teachers who stopped by with coffee. I gave advice with steady eyes and patient words, but inside, I was unraveling thread by thread. At home, I learned how to make silence my disguise. When Mark pulled away from me in small, almost imperceptible ways, I pretended not to notice. I made dinner, cleared dishes, folded laundry, and tucked Lily into conversations about college. I laughed at the right moments and nodded when it was expected. My life became a careful performance, and every night I retreated into the bathroom, locked the door, and let the tears fall in the quiet. There, the sound of water running masked the grief that I couldn't show in the open. Mark's distance grew sharper, like a blade pressed against thin skin. He answered questions with curt tones or with too much sweetness, the kind of tone that comes when guilt needs to cover itself in charm. He kept his phone close, never left it charging on the counter as he once had. It became an extension of his hand, his pocket, his nightstand. The glow of it in the dark was enough to turn my stomach. The hardest part was Lily. She had no idea what I was carrying, and I was determined to shield her. She would sprawl on her bed in the evenings talking about dorm visits, essays, and what it would feel like to leave home. I listened with a smile, my heart aching at the thought of her stepping into adulthood with a house divided behind her. When she asked why her father was working late so often, I forced a calm answer, saying he had responsibilities and deadlines. She accepted it because she still believed in us, in the structure of our family, the same way I once did. There were nights when I thought of confiding in Walter. He had always been kind, a man of simple honesty, who loved his granddaughter fiercely. Sometimes he would stop by on a Saturday, bringing fresh peaches from a roadside stand, his eyes scanning the house as though he could sense the tension. He never asked directly, but once, as he stood in the doorway to leave, he rested a hand on my shoulder and said quietly, "Don't let him forget what matters." I nodded, swallowing words I couldn't bring myself to speak. Even my body began to feel the weight of keeping secrets. I lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, counting the rhythm of Mark's breathing beside me, wondering if he dreamed of her while I fought against sleep. I woke with headaches that clung to me through the day. Food lost its flavor, and I dropped weight without trying. My reflection in the mirror showed hollow eyes and a mouth that no longer curved easily into smiles. I became unrecognizable to myself, yet no one else seemed to notice. One evening, as I gathered laundry, I found a receipt crumpled in Mark's pants pocket. It was from a restaurant across town, the kind of place we only went to on anniversaries. The date printed at the top matched a night he had claimed to be stuck late at work. I stood in the laundry room holding that slip of paper, my hands trembling as though it were a weapon. My instinct was to confront him immediately, but instead, I slid it into a book on the shelf. Proof was no longer about what I believed. It was about what I could one day show. The walls of our house began to carry the weight of my silence. Every chair, every photograph, every familiar corner seemed to hold memories of a time when I had trusted him. Now those same spaces pressed against me like accusations. I found myself lingering in Lily's room, where posters curled at the edges and textbooks lay scattered. Her innocence was a shield, a reminder that I had something worth holding steady for even as my marriage faltered. Mark's absences became predictable, his excuses recycled. The words late meeting and client dinner blurred into a pattern I could chart on a calendar. Tessa's name surfaced casually, then slipped away just as quickly, leaving an aftertaste in every conversation. I watched the way his eyes flickered when he spoke of her, the way his voice carried a softness it hadn't held for me in years. He thought I was blind, but I was watching closely, memorizing each detail. Some nights, I sat on the porch after Lily had gone to bed, listening to the sound of cicadas in the dark. The cool air pressed against my skin as I wrapped a blanket around my shoulders. I stared at the driveway waiting for his car lights to appear, and wondered who he was with in those missing hours. The stillness became unbearable, but I stayed there anyway, as though witnessing his absence could somehow prepare me for what I already knew in my bones. Inside, my heart broke quietly, without witnesses. No shouting, no slammed doors, just a steady ache that grew heavier with each passing day. I had learned how to hide it well, but grief has a way of seeping into everything. It lived in my gestures, in the forced calm of my voice, in the way I avoided meeting my own eyes in the mirror. The silence was no longer simply between us. It had seeped into me, filling every corner of who I was. I felt like a stranger in my own life, and yet I carried on because that is what women like me have always done. But beneath the layers of sorrow, something else was beginning to take root. It was faint, fragile, and easily overlooked, but it was there. It was the thought that one day the silence would not belong to him. It would belong to me. And when that day came, I would no longer be the one holding broken pieces together. I would be the one deciding how to let them fall. The morning that shifted everything began like any other. The sun filtered through the blinds, casting narrow stripes of light across our bedroom. Mark's phone buzzed on the nightstand, sharp against the stillness. He stirred, silenced it quickly, and turned away, but I had already seen the name on the screen. Tessa. Her name in black letters on the glow of his phone, sitting there, as though it had every right to greet us at dawn. I didn't speak. I dressed for work with deliberate calm, slipping into my navy blazer and sliding my lunch into my bag. The air between us was heavy, charged with what I now refused to pretend I hadn't seen. He gave me a casual goodbye kiss at the door, but his lips didn't linger. My heart thudded not with grief, but with clarity. That day at school, I sat across from a student who was struggling with her parents' divorce. She said softly, "It's like I'm the only one who knows what's happening, but I can't say it out loud." Her words struck me like a mirror held to my own face. For months, I had carried the truth in silence, waiting for it to collapse on its own. Now I knew it never would. That evening, when I returned home, Mark was in the living room, scrolling through his phone, the television humming in the background. I set down my bag and studied him. the man I had shared my life with for more than 2 decades. He looked up smiling faintly and asked, "How was your day?" The question sounded hollow. I answered briefly, then excused myself to the bedroom. Behind the closed door, I sat on the edge of the bed and let the truth settle inside me like a stone. He wasn't mine anymore, not in the way that mattered. For the first time, I allowed myself to think clearly about what had been happening. The late nights, the floral scent, the laughter at dinners, the guarded phone, it all lined up too perfectly to ignore. The denial I had clung to slipped away, leaving me with something sharper, something steadier. I wasn't imagining this. I wasn't overreacting. I had been betrayed, and pretending otherwise only gave him more power. I began noticing small details with new eyes. The way he dressed with more attention to detail when he claimed to be working late, the careful tone he used when explaining texts that had buzzed at odd hours, the quick glances toward me as if to check whether I was buying the story. He thought he was covering his tracks, but he underestimated the woman who had spent half a lifetime reading his moods. That weekend, Lily went to stay with a friend. The house felt quiet, and I took the opportunity to look more closely. I wasn't reckless. I didn't rifle through his belongings or hack into his accounts. But I paid attention. A receipt left on the counter for wine we hadn't shared. A calendar alert on his laptop for a meeting that fell on a Sunday afternoon. The clues were no longer whispers. They were shouts echoing through the walls of our home. Sunday evening, he walked in later than usual, his tie loosened, smelling faintly of a perfume that didn't belong to me. I watched him place his jacket carefully over the back of a chair, his phone tucked quickly into his pocket. "Traffic was awful," he said lightly, as though that explained everything. I smiled, nodded, and offered him leftovers from dinner. My calm seemed to reassure him, and he relaxed completely, unaware that my silence had shifted from wounded to deliberate. I thought of Walter often in those days. He had raised his son to value loyalty and commitment, and I wondered how he would react if he knew the truth. I didn't tell him. Not yet. I wasn't ready for voices of pity or anger. I wanted something different, something stronger than confrontation. For the first time, I felt the stirrings of resolve. I would not crumble in the shadow of Mark's betrayal. I would watch. I would wait. And when the time came, I would decide how this story ended. That night, lying beside him, I studied the ceiling and let the hum of the air conditioner fill the silence. His breathing was steady, his arm resting across me in a gesture that once would have felt comforting. Now it felt like a chain. My heart no longer begged for him to change, no longer hoped for explanations that would make sense of the lies. Instead, I felt a slow, steady burn of strength rising from the very place that had once been hollowed out. The truth was no longer something I feared. It was something I carried sharp and undeniable, pressed close against me. And in carrying it, I knew I had taken the first step away from the woman who wept in silence and toward the woman who would one day reclaim her dignity. The question that kept me awake wasn't whether Mark loved Tessa or whether he would ever admit what he was doing. It was how long I would let him believe I was still in the dark. Once the denial had burned away and the truth settled inside me, a different kind of calm began to take its place. It wasn't the fragile quiet of despair anymore. It was deliberate steady, like the slow tightening of a knot. I moved through my days as though nothing had changed, but beneath the stillness, I began to make choices that Mark could not see. The first thing I did was separate our finances. Quietly, I opened a new account in my name, only diverting my paycheck to it with a few clicks at the credit union. The joint account remained untouched, still receiving his deposit, still covering bills, but my income was no longer within his reach. I gathered important documents, marriage certificate, house deed, insurance papers. and placed them in a slim folder that fit neatly beneath a stack of old textbooks in my office at school. No one would think to look there. I also began writing down dates, times, and small details, not in one place, but in several. A journal hidden in my nightstand held vague notes: late dinner perfume again. On my work computer, I kept a private file under a harmless label documenting receipts and moments I could no longer ignore. Even my phone contained quiet evidence snapshots of crumpled receipts or text previews that betrayed his lies. I was building a record not out of panic, but with the calm of someone who had stopped hoping he would change. One afternoon, after a particularly long day at school, I sat in my car and dialed a number a colleague had given me months before. James Holloway had once helped a fellow counselor through a difficult divorce. His reputation was solid, discreet, practical, never one to stir unnecessary drama. I told myself I wasn't calling to end my marriage, only to know where I stood if the time came. We met in his office, a quiet space lined with law books and framed certificates. He listened more than he spoke, letting me explain in halting detail the suspicions I carried. When I handed him a few of the receipts and notes, he studied them without judgment. "You're right to prepare," he said gently. "Whether you use this or not, knowledge is power." He explained what documentation would matter if I chose to leave, what steps I could take to protect myself and Lily, and what not to do in the meantime. I left with a clear plan folded neatly in my purse, hidden like a secret weapon. At home, I let Mark continue believing I was blind. When he slipped out on a Saturday morning claiming a work call, I wished him well and asked if he wanted me to set aside lunch. He kissed my cheek lightly and left, never noticing how my eyes no longer searched his face for answers. When he returned hours later, smelling faintly of perfume and hotel soap, I greeted him with calm politeness, as though I were none the wiser. He thought the performance was his. He never realized I had taken the stage from him. I also began observing Tessa more closely. Whenever we crossed paths at neighborhood gatherings or mutual friends events, I paid attention to her tone, her gestures, the way her laughter lingered in Mark's direction. She carried herself with the confidence of someone who believed she was winning. I never let her see the storm building in me. Instead, I offered her the same measured warmth I gave everyone else. If she thought my silence meant ignorance, that suited me just fine. Protecting Lily became my quiet priority. I encouraged her to focus on her studies, to visit colleges with friends, to spend time with people who lifted her up. She noticed the changes in our home, though she couldn't name them. Sometimes she asked softly, "Are you okay, Mom?" I would smile, tuck a strand of hair behind her ear, and say, "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just tired." In truth, I was exhausted from the weight of secrecy, but I carried it so she wouldn't have to. Even Walter remained in the dark, though I sensed his growing suspicion. He would stop by with the groceries or call to check on Lily, his voice carrying the weight of a man who had seen too many fractures in life. Once, as he left our driveway, I caught him glancing back at the house. His brow furrowed, as though something didn't sit right. I wanted to tell him everything, but I wasn't ready. Not until I had the ground beneath me secured. Mark had no idea that each of his absences strengthened my resolve. He believed his secrets were slipping past me unseen. What he didn't realize was that I was quietly constructing a foundation beneath myself, one that would not break when the final betrayal came crashing down. The silence between us no longer belonged to him, it belonged to me. I went to bed each night beside him, his arm draped carelessly across me, and I stared at the ceiling in the dark. My breathing stayed steady, but inside my mind ticked forward like a clock. I was no longer waiting for him to confess or to change. I was waiting for this moment when my quiet preparation would meet his arrogance head on. And when that day arrived, I would not be the one caught unprepared. The breaking point didn't arrive with a whisper. It came crashing into my life at a community fundraiser, the kind of evening where neighbors mingled under strings of lights and the air carried the scent of barbecue and sweet tea. I had been helping at the raffle table when I saw them, Mark and Tessa, standing far too close near the refreshment stand. His hand brushed her arm, and she leaned in, whispering something that pulled laughter from him. It was a sound I hadn't heard directed at me in months. For a moment, the world blurred, but then clarity returned, sharper than ever. This was the stage they had chosen, and I would not leave it in silence. I stepped forward, weaving through clusters of people until I reached them. Mark, I said evenly, my voice steady enough to turn heads. He spun startled guilt flashing across his face before he smoothed it away. Tessa's lips parted, and she clutched her wine glass like it could anchor her. The crowd quieted slightly, conversations dimming as eyes shifted toward us. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I simply pulled from my bag a folded packet of papers, copies of receipts, notes, and records James Holloway had helped me prepare. I placed them on the table between us, my gaze steady. "These are yours, aren't they?" My words were directed at Mark, but they hung in the air for everyone nearby. He reached for the papers too quickly, trying to hide them, but the motion was clumsy, desperate. Someone in the crowd gasped softly. Tessa flushed deep red, her polished confidence crumbling as the weight of the moment pressed in. Mark tried to recover. "This is ridiculous." He snapped, his voice sharp, though the tremor underneath betrayed him. "Elena, not here." But here was exactly where the mask needed to fall. "Why not here?" I asked calmly. "You seemed comfortable enough bringing her into every corner of our lives. Comfortable enough to think no one would notice." My tone was measured, almost gentle, but it carried further than anger ever could. Walter had been nearby chatting with a neighbor, and I saw his head lift at the sound of my voice. He crossed the lawn with a frown deepening on his face, his weathered hands clenched loosely at his sides. "What's going on?" he asked, his eyes shifting from me to his son. Mark opened his mouth, but no words came. For the first time, he was stripped of the performance that had carried him for months. Tessa tried to step in, her voice brittle. "This isn't what it looks like. We were just—" But she faltered under the weight of so many eyes, the neighbors she had once charmed, now staring at her with suspicion. I didn't need to argue. I didn't need to explain. I simply held my ground, letting silence expose what their words could not disguise. Mark's father turned to him, his voice low but sharp enough to cut through the night. "Is it true?" The pause stretched, and in that hesitation, every answer we needed was laid bare. Mark didn't admit it outright, but his silence was worse than confession. Walter's shoulders sagged, and he stepped back, shaking his head slowly, the disappointment etched deep into his features. I gathered the papers back into my bag, not with haste, but with deliberate calm. "I think we're done here," I said quietly enough for him to hear, but loud enough for the crowd to carry it further. Then I turned, leaving them in the glow of string lights, their whispers following me like a tide. The fundraiser continued, but for Mark and Tessa, the night had ended. Back at home, the walls felt different. I moved through each room as though reclaiming them, touching the back of a chair, straightening a frame, closing a drawer. The house no longer felt like a stage where I was forced to play a role. It felt like mine again, even if only for a moment. Mark came in later, his voice sharp as he called my name. I met him in the kitchen where the overhead light cast harsh shadows. "You humiliated me," he hissed, slamming his hand against the counter. "In front of everyone." I folded my arms, meeting his fury with stillness. "No, Mark. You did that yourself. I just stopped protecting your lies." His eyes narrowed, searching for the woman who had once bent to his charm, but she was no longer there. His anger swelled, words spilling out in jagged fragments about betrayal, about dignity, about what I owed him after all these years. I let him speak until his voice cracked. Then I simply said, "You'll be hearing from James Holloway." The silence that followed was heavier than any argument. He stared at me, the realization settling in that the game he thought he controlled had shifted entirely. His shoulders slumped, and for the first time, he looked smaller to me, diminished by the weight of his own choices. He left the kitchen without another word, his footsteps heavy against the hardwood. That night, I lay in bed alone. The sheets were cool, the house quiet, except for the hum of the refrigerator. I should have felt sorrow, but instead, I felt a strange peace. The secret was no longer mine to carry. The truth had been spoken, exposed under lights and whispers, and there was no returning to the shadows. As I drifted into sleep, one thought anchored me. The hardest part was behind me. The storm had broken, but justice was still ahead, and I was ready for it. In the days after the fundraiser, the silence around Mark and Tessa turned into something heavier than whispers. Neighbors who once waved warmly began crossing the street, their smiles forced their eyes darting elsewhere. At church pews that had always been full around us, suddenly had gaps in conversations that used to flow easily became awkward and clipped. People didn't need the details. The public exposure had been enough. What they saw was a man caught in his own deception, and the woman who had thought she could hide behind him. At home, Mark grew restless, pacing through the rooms like a man without footing. His voice, once so sure, cracked when he spoke to me, swinging between brittle anger and hollow apologies. He called me cold, accused me of orchestrating everything, as though I had somehow built his lies for him. When that failed, he tried to soften his words, dripping with regret, promising change, and begging for a second chance. But I no longer responded with tears or pleading. My stillness unsettled him more than any argument could. Tessa did not fare much better. She lost 2 major clients within a week, both citing conflicts of interest as polite excuses. Friends who once championed her events declined invitations, and the glow she carried at parties dimmed to a nervous edge. She stopped showing up at gatherings altogether, her absence more telling than her presence. Even Lily noticed, asking casually, "Why don't we see Ms. Grant anymore?" I smiled softly, telling her only that some friendships weren't meant to last. Meanwhile, James Holloway moved quietly in the background, preparing the paperwork with steady precision. He gathered the documentation I had collected, tying the threads together into a narrative no judge could dismiss. Mark had drained accounts we once shared, using money on nights and gifts that never reached our home. He had left enough of a trail that no denial could erase it. When James laid out the options across his desk, I nodded, feeling the weight of decision settle firmly in my hands. The day Mark was served, he stood in the kitchen, the envelope trembling in his grip. His face drained of color as he flipped through the pages, each one spelling out what he had tried so hard to conceal. He looked at me then, eyes wide with something close to fear. "You can't do this," he said, his voice low. "You'll ruin me." I met his gaze steadily. "You already did that yourself." There was nothing more to say. Word spread quickly, as it always does. His colleagues learned of the pending divorce, and soon after he was quietly removed from a high-profile account. Clients hesitated to take his calls, his polished image tarnished beyond repair. The man who had once thrived on charm and confidence now found doors closing in every direction. His temper, once mistaken for passion, became a liability too visible to ignore. Walter came by one evening, his shoulders stooped, but his eyes fierce. He sat at my kitchen table, folding his weathered hands around a mug of coffee. "I raised him better," he said softly, his voice thick with grief. "But I'm proud of you, Elena. You didn't let him take you down with him." I reached across the table, resting my hand over his. We sat there, in shared silence, bound not by blood, but by the truth we both could no longer deny. Through it all, I remained steady for Lily. I kept her routines intact, encouraged her dreams, and made sure her life was not overshadowed by the wreckage of her father's choices. She asked questions sometimes sharp and curious, but I answered carefully, giving her honesty without bitterness. She deserved clarity, but she also deserved peace. And as her future opened before her, I wanted her to know that betrayal was not the end of a story. It could be the beginning of a stronger one. Mark and Tessa's alliance, once so smugly certain, began to fracture under pressure. They were seen arguing in public, their once private connection dissolving into blame and sharp words. Whatever had bound them together could not withstand the light of exposure. They had built their plans on deceit, and deceit cannot hold when the truth is standing in plain view. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. Watching their lives unravel was not about revenge in the loud sense. It was about justice quietly finding its balance. I had spent months in silence carrying the weight of their lies. Now it was their turn to live in the echo of that silence, stripped of excuses and left to face themselves. As autumn settled in, the air grew crisp and leaves fell across the lawn. I felt a calm I hadn't known in years. The storm had broken, and though the damage around me was visible, the foundation beneath me remained. I had built it myself, brick by brick, in the quiet hours of planning, in the steady resolve of waiting. Now I stood firmly on it, unshaken. Yet one final step remained, the closure that would not only free me, but define the path forward. And as I looked out the window that evening, the golden light fading across the trees, I knew the moment was near. The weeks after everything came to light felt strangely quiet, not empty, but cleared like a house finally aired out after years of stale air. Mark no longer filled the rooms with his restless pacing or sharp words. Tessa faded into the background as though she had never been more than a shadow. What they had tried to build together collapsed under the weight of their own choices, and I didn't have to lift a finger to push it down. Justice has a way of finding its place when truth is steady enough to hold. Walter visited often during that time, sometimes with groceries, sometimes with nothing more than company. We sat at my kitchen table, drinking coffee, the silence between us no longer heavy, but companionable. He carried disappointment in his son, yes, but he carried pride in me too. I never asked for that pride, but it warmed me in ways I hadn't realized I still needed. For Lily, I kept life steady. She filled our evenings with laughter about college plans and stories about friends, and I let her excitement wash over me like sunlight. She didn't need to inherit the weight of her father's mistakes. She needed to see that betrayal didn't end us. It only changed the shape of our lives. She looked at me sometimes with quiet admiration, and in those moments I understood that the lesson I was passing to her was far more important than the one I had given Mark. The divorce went through without spectacle. James Holloway guided me carefully each step, measured each paper signed with calm resolve. Mark fought at first, but without leverage, his arguments dissolved. In the end, he walked away with less than he expected, burdened by the reputation he had tarnished himself. I didn't celebrate his loss. I simply accepted it as the natural conclusion to the path he had chosen. I began to reclaim small joys, the kind I had set aside without noticing. Planting flowers in the front yard, baking pies on Sunday afternoons, reading novels late into the night without checking the clock. These were not grand victories, but quiet ones, and they mattered more than anything else. Each act reminded me that dignity is not restored in a courtroom or a public outing. It is restored in the way we choose to live after the storm. Sometimes late at night, I thought back to the woman I was before everything broke, the one who held her silence in bathrooms, the one who feared the truth she already knew. She felt like a stranger now, someone I could look at with compassion, but no longer recognize in myself. The scars of betrayal are real, but they no longer defined me. They became markers of healing proof that I had walked through fire and emerged standing. Justice didn't look like revenge. It looked like peace. It looked like a home where my daughter could laugh freely, where my father-in-law could visit without tension, where I could breathe without waiting for lies to reveal themselves. That was the gift I had fought for, not through rage or destruction, but through quiet strength and steady choices. Before we close, I'd love to know what part of this journey spoke most to you. Share your thoughts in the comments below, and if you'd like to hear more true family stories, stay connected here.